Wonderful. It's so good to see everyone this afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's session. This webinar today is part of our Capital Conversation series, where we provide a unique opportunity to hear directly from key policymakers, leading experts, and the Lutheran Services in America staff about the latest policy developments and their implications. Today, we'll hear first from Melissia Robinson of EverTrue with a quick overview of their efforts to pass a senior services levy in St. Louis County. Then we'll learn more about how nonprofits can engage in effective advocacy as 501c3 organizations. Our main speaker, Blair Abelle-Kiser from Social Current, will discuss the essentials of advocacy and lobbying for the nonprofit sector. With time, we'll also have time for discussion and questions. So we're very thankful they're both joining us today to share their valuable expertise. And before we get started, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Dobson on our team, who's going to provide a brief update on what's happening on the Hill. Sarah.
Thank you, Alicia. And first, before we formally begin, I'd like to remind everybody we do want this to be an interactive session. So please feel free to enter your questions in the chat box at any point. We'll also have an opportunity to call on folks when we get to that portion of Blair's presentation. And then before we formally begin, we do, as usual, want to gauge everyone's understanding of our topic and kind of how much we move the needle today with our speakers and our information. So I'm going to launch a quick one question poll that we hope you will answer, and we'll let that percolate for just a minute, and then I'll share the results. And this says, how would you rate your current knowledge of the rules nonprofits must follow to engage in advocacy and lobbying? And there are 9 of us out here. We'll give folks one more minute. Okay, so we had only 11% with strong knowledge, 22 with good knowledge, and then the majority of folks with no, limited, or basic knowledge. And so we hope we can certainly move people into basic or good knowledge and maybe even strong knowledge, and can explain to others by the end of our session today. So I'm going to be very, very brief in talking about what's going on the Hill, because I know we want to get to our good content today, primarily to share a couple of things. One, this isn't the Hill, but it's an implication of something that's happened on the Hill. We are focusing pretty strongly as a policy and advocacy team here on implementation efforts of HR 1, the quote unquote one big beautiful bill, and what that means for Medicaid and the people who are beneficiaries of it, and those of us of our network who are providers. There's really action at this point in the state level, and so we're monitoring that, and we're also looking at how CMS is providing guidance to states as they work to roll that out. The requirements aren't technically in effect yet, but certainly states are preparing to meet those requirements and getting systems in place. And so as we learn more and hear more about those things, we're sharing them with you. If you haven't already signed up and don't receive our Capital Communications newsletter every 2 weeks, we hope you'll do that. That's a really good resource for us to share that information. And then just 2 other quick things. We're still waiting on a resolution to the one remaining appropriations bill for this fiscal year. That's the Department of Homeland Security bill, and that's continues to be a fight over funding levels for ICE. Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, who's the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, has, I believe yesterday, introduced a bill that would fund pretty much everything other than ICE from DHS, so that we could at least get the rest of the government of that department moving. I don't know that that's going to move forward, but there are some efforts. And then secondly, we are still monitoring what's now called the 21st Century Road to Housing Act, which has a lot of good provisions that support affordable housing and programs working toward health services and human services and coordination in housing. That's now a bipartisan, bicameral bill that has pretty strong support across the board, except that now there's some opposition from conservative Republicans in the House, specifically surrounding a provision that actually does not relate to housing. It relates to whether or not the Federal Reserve can create a digital currency. And there's a temporary ban on that. They would like to see a permanent ban. And so there's a question now of how that piece of the puzzle will be resolved. So we're waiting to see that, but continue to be hopeful and continue to hear from committee staff on both sides that they foresee this passing, but it is a little bit harder of a road than they had hoped. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our colleague Melissia Robinson, who, as Alicia mentioned, is going to share with us some information about a funding effort they're working on in St. Louis County to help provide for senior services. So Melissia.
Thank you very much. And thank you for including me on the agenda today. Hello, everyone. I am Melissia Robinson. I'm the Director of Grant Funded Programs for EverTrue Anywhere Care in St. Louis, Missouri. I've served in various roles in various settings in the aging services industry for over 30 years. Most of my career has been spent in the home and community-based services area. I'm the president of the board of directors for the Missouri Council for In-Home Services. I serve on the board for the Missouri Council on Aging, and I'm also on the Leading Age Advocacy Committee. Advocacy does work. I'm also fortunate to serve on the executive committee for the St. Louis County Seniors Count Initiative. I'm aware that Adam, our president and CEO, gave you a broad overview of the Seniors Count Initiative, so I'm here today to provide you with some additional information. Missouri is one of 15 states that have passed enabling legislation to allow counties to pass property tax levies to fund senior services. Currently, 57 Missouri counties have a senior fund. We tried to get the Senior Count Initiative passed in St. Louis County in 2016, and it missed passing by 1 percentage point in St. Louis County, but it did pass in St. Louis City. And I have been a grateful recipient of that funding from St. Louis City Senior Fund and have both a 10,000 feet up and a boots on the ground understanding of the amazing work this funding has done for our older adults we serve and the caregivers who serve them. The work that is done includes things such as minor home repair, in-home support, utility assistance, and many other types of services. And the funded organizations, we work together collaboratively to ensure that service needs are being met. And we also work with local and state aging infrastructure to make sure it is strengthened. So how does a senior levy fund work? If you have a home valued at $275,000, you're taxed on 19% of that value. That would be $52,250. A nickel of every $100 goes to the Senior Service Fund each year, which would be a total of $26.12. In St. Louis County, it is projected that this would allow for approximately $17 million annually to provide services for seniors, and those would be through a grant application process. According to the St. Louis Business Journal, the St. Louis region has the 3rd largest percentage of people age 65 and over in the USA. That equates to 1 in 4 of the county residents. With funding changes and uncertainty on both the federal and state level, we determined it was time to revisit the effort in St. Louis County. Led by Jamie Opsel, a recognized leader for senior programs and advocacy in Missouri, in collaboration with an aging-friendly St. Louis County Older Adults Commission, the journey began. We started with polling, focus groups, informational meetings, and eventually selected the executive committee to support the initiative. Through meetings with the county council members, we landed bipartisan support with St. Louis County. Our political consultant group advised us to make the decision to move forward and not look back. On February 3rd, we provided presentation and testimony to the St. Louis County Council members. We filled the council chambers with local organizations, service providers, and seniors. The turnout was amazing. We have a great committee of aging and disability partners in St. Louis County, including OASIS, Rebuilding Together, Cardinal Ritter Senior Services, Marriott Mission Fund, BSI St. Louis, the Community Health Commission, Bethesda Health Group, the Urban League of St. Louis, and EverTrue. To date, we have received funding from several foundations who support aging projects for our education campaign, which includes Marriott Delta Dental, Missouri Foundation for Health, Mid-America Transplant, the Doherty Foundation, the Lutheran Foundation, and others. And we are in the process of recruiting community members from individual county areas to assist with education. EverTrue residents from our affordable housing committees are engaged in this process. We are sharing stories to be included on social media that demonstrate the success of the program. Our individual organizations are also reaching out to donors, vendors, and partners to assist with fundraising efforts for our Get Out the Vote campaign. Our political consultants will be conducting focused polling to provide us with feedback and direction. We will be on the November 2026 ballot. We are focused on success as we move to get this across the finish line. We are a strong, determined, and resilient group of aging services leaders committed to making this happen because seniors truly do count. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And this is just a great example of different tax proposals that we're starting to see to shore up funding for Medicaid in light of the cuts that have transpired from HR 1. As Melissa pointed out, we're going to need a lot of creative solutions to fill the budget holes that we're seeing. And with that, I'm really happy to pivot and to introduce Blair again, who's going to be presenting a great presentation for us on the importance of engaging in advocacy and the rules for nonprofits as they do so. And with that, I will let Blair take it from there. Thank you, Blair.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. I'm going to give a lot of really what I think is impactful information. At times, it might seem a little bit overwhelming. I hope not, but if so, please feel free to throw a question up in the box so that we can get your questions answered and we can build some foundational knowledge here. As Sarah mentioned, I am Dr. Blair Abelle-Kiser, and I'm here to talk to you today about the essentials of advocacy and lobbying for the nonprofit sector. So our areas of focus that we're going to hit today is we're going to try to understand the full spectrum available in terms of advocacy for nonprofits. We're going to talk about recognizing where lobbying, which is kind of a scary word for a lot of organizations, fits within our broader advocacy framework. We're going to have some strategies that we can aid in tracking and recording our lobbying and advocacy initiatives with the overall goal of maintaining our 501c3 status with the federal government. And finally, we're going to identify quickly how various organizational roles intersect with public policy and institutional leadership. So off the top, I want to talk about the importance of advocacy. And you're all here today because you recognize that advocacy is important. You recognize that it's important to share our knowledge, to share the voices of the communities we serve, to share our expertise that each of our organizations and each of your different branches hold about your communities and share those with policymakers. It's incredibly important that we do that to continue to push forward policies on federal, state, and local level that benefit and lift our communities up. However, we are in a period of rapid change. If you watch the news, if you read newsletters, if you're just paying attention in the slightest, you know that our country is in a period of rapid change, and our nonprofit sector is experiencing rapid shift in federal climate. And it's becoming increasingly important for all of our organizations to maintain and build strong relationships with our federally elected representatives. And we can do this, and the purpose of doing this is we can detail specific harms that various agency directives, executive orders, and legislation have caused not only our organizations and our ability to serve our communities, but our communities as a whole. And as a result of our advocacy, we hope that our representatives are able to take steps, hopefully, to mitigate that harm. And as I go around and I talk to organizations across the country over the last 2 years, I really want to hit home that when we remain silent, when we refuse to advocate, when we refuse to speak up, when we look and we say, you know, my organization does great work, we're going to keep our nose to the grindstone, we're going to keep our heads down, and people will recognize the good that we've done. Well, we've inadvertently, because we do such great work and the work is so consuming, we've almost created a vacuum. We have let others sometimes speak for our sector and speak about the work that we do. And in a vacuum, harmful narratives take root. And through advocacy, we can push back against maybe some of the more harmful narratives about the sector and start to implant new stories and tell new stories and give way to a narrative that builds a trust, that continues to build trust within our communities. A couple key sector challenges that I just want to highlight briefly and how those tie into advocacy. Sarah said it at the very top. Through this Congress, HR 1, the quote unquote big beautiful bill, it's raised critical concerns about how our communities are going to adapt to stark reductions in things like Medicaid and nutrition funding. We've seen executive orders that have, in some instances, paused federal funding, gotten rid of federal funding, canceled grants that's misaligned with the administration's purposes, resulting in accompanying agency memos have concentrated the power of the executive branch and restricted pathways to integrate public feedback to those changes. And finally, litigation across the board has amended our compliance requirements, it's reversed federal orders, and it's really raising further compliance challenges for 501c3 organizations, as similar litigation has also introduced conflicting orders. And one litigation that I want to highlight deals with something called the Johnson Amendment. And amid this uncertain and rapidly shifting federal landscape, there's been a lawsuit against the IRS that introduces a real pressing concern for that foundational protection that guards nonprofit nonpartisanship. That is the Johnson Amendment. And nonpartisanship is an incredibly central pillar to our ability to protect trust within our sector by ensuring our work remains mission and value driven. The nonprofit sector as a whole, if you look at recent surveys, the nonprofit sector as a whole maintains the highest level of trust of any public institution in this country. And we've obtained and we retain this high level of trust because we are viewed as above the political fray. We're viewed as not partisan. We're viewed as taking actions that are purely in service of our communities. And there's been a challenge to that Johnson Amendment, which is again going to be a challenge to our nonpartisanship and our ability to maintain trust with our communities. So let's break down the Johnson Amendment just a little bit. What does it say? And what it says is that 501c3 organizations cannot and will not endorse or oppose political candidates, and doing so puts our tax-exempt status at risk. And it exists in theory because the federal government, the general populace subsidizes our nonprofit tax-exempt status. And as a result, because our country has said, you're doing an amazing work in our communities, you're doing a benefit to the people that are within our communities, and as a result, your organizations are going to be exempt from taxes. But as a trade-off, you're not going to be allowed in electoral politics. You can still advocate for issues, but you cannot pick political candidates. And what's happened is that the National Religious Broadcasting Association has entered into what's called a consent agreement with the IRS. What a consent agreement is where two parties come before a judge and they say, this party A, wants to takes an interpretation of the law. We want to go about a certain action. And the enforcing agency, the IRS in this case, says in the consent agreement, we agree with their interpretation. And what this consent agreement proposes is that these two specific churches that are party to this consent agreement would not be subject to Johnson Amendment enforcement, and as a result, would be able to make political endorsements. What this does is, while it still only applies in the immediate to those two churches in Texas, it really erodes the enforcement mechanisms around the Johnson Amendment. It really puts in the question, well, if we're not enforcing it for these two specific churches, why are we not, and these two specific nonprofits, why are we enforcing it all across the board? And if we lose that Johnson Amendment, we're really eroding the nonpartisan firewall that gives our sector as a whole its public credibility and maintains our trust and our ability to work in our communities. So this is just a brief timeline. The consent agreement does require approval by a federal district court. Specifically, this one starts in the Eastern District of Texas. There hasn't been any movement on it since last July. We expect something to occur this year, and anything that does occur at that district level will most likely be appealed to the next level, the appellate court. I don't remember off the top of my head which circuit that is. And so even no matter the outcome in the Eastern District of Texas, this consent agreement is in store for a lot of litigation going forward. So just off the top, these are things that your organization can do to respond to the Johnson Amendment threat. You can document your nonpartisanship now. Audit your board minutes, look at your public communications, look at your website, confirm that you have political neutrality, it's clearly documented, and nothing you can say can be looked at as endorsing or rejecting a political candidate. Now, I want to point out that while some issues that your organization may advocate for, or issues that are core to your mission, may appear partisan because support for it belies on one side of the political aisle or the other. But that is not the same as nonpartisanship in terms of selecting or endorsing candidates or rejecting them. Brief your board and your leadership. Talk to your board, talk to your staff, make sure they can articulate the line between advocacy, which is permitted, lobbying, which is also permitted, and candidate endorsement, which is explicitly prohibited. And we're going to talk in this presentation a little bit about how to tell the difference between the two. Also, no matter what happens with this specific consent agreement, don't treat non-enforcement as permission to just completely ignore the Johnson Amendment. At the end of the day, the consent agreement only is going to protect the churches that are named in the agreement. Your 501c3 status is going to remain fully subject to the Johnson Amendment, no matter what the outcome of that consent agreement is. So I want to talk a little bit where we go from here. And first I want to start off the top that advocacy is legal, necessary, and expected. Let's define advocacy a little bit. Advocacy is actions that aim to bring awareness to, generate support for, or act on behalf of an issue locally, statewide, or federally. A couple different examples are publishing testimonials, meeting with your representatives to discuss an issue, putting out social media posts explaining a policy issue, publishing a brief on it. And we always want to be doing advocacy. We always want to be educating the public, educating our community, educating our sector, because through our shared action, we're able to amplify our reach, amplify our strength, and further all of our missions as a sector. Advocacy does not require partisanship. I realize that some of the issues that we as a sector or you as an organization might care about, you might say, Blair, we look at this issue and we go to Capitol Hill and we talk to members of Congress, and it's only one party, one specific political party that agrees with us en masse. And the other one is, and a lot of times, wholesale opposed to what we're talking about. While the issue may appear partisan, and that the support of it is partisan, our advocacy is not partisan. And when we act without bias and always have that genuine intent to offer education and collaborate, organizations are going to be able to effectively share and amplify their mission and values. I say it again, advocacy is legal and it is expected. A lot of organizations, especially in the last 2 years, are very afraid of advocacy. They are very afraid of lobbying. I'm here to tell you that it is legal. Both are legal and both are expected. Organizations often advocate on behalf of their core issues simply by engaging in the organization's mission to increase the awareness of the issues that you care about and address the challenges to those issues. So, All 501c3 status organizations are permitted to engage in the following actions without limits: educating the public and policymakers. You can go to your member of Congress and you can explain issues as much as you want, as many days as you want, with as much and spend as much time and money as you want to educate policymakers and the public about issues that you have an awareness of and an understanding of. Joining coalitions and coordinating your messaging on these issues is completely allowed without limits. Building relationships with Congress and community members. You can have a member of Congress or their staff come and tour your organization, can come and tour your facility, can come to an event that you're hosting in your community as much as they want without limit. You're allowed to lobby for specific line items, that's appropriations, things that the government is going to supply money for, or bills. There are some IRS limits to this that we'll talk about in just a moment. You're allowed to submit testimony when testimony is requested or open for committee hearings in, say, the House or the Senate. And you are free to use private funds to support your advocacy. Prohibited advocacy for 501c3s. Your 501c3 status does not support, and this is the quickest way and the clearest way to lose that nonprofit status: endorsing, supporting, or opposing political candidates, partisan activity in any form, or, and this is a large one, using federal funds for lobbying or campaign contributions. So you're saying that, wait, Blair, I thought you said lobbying was allowed with some limits. Here's one of the limits. You cannot use federal funds for lobbying, and you cannot make campaign contributions to it begin with, and you can especially cannot use federal funds to make campaign contributions. So, how can we differentiate between advocacy and lobbying? Lobbying is an effort to influence government action or non-action. While advocacy is about educating, lobbying is about influencing action or non-action. And to lobby, I'll give you a quick two-part test how you can determine whether you advocated or whether you lobbied. All lobbying initiatives require you to reference a specific bill or appropriation and urge a vote or action on that bill or appropriation. If you do not have those two boxes checked, then you have not lobbied. Some common examples of lobbying, just to make folks aware: meeting with representatives where you advocate for increased funding of a specific program, or leading a grassroots campaign in favor or against legislation. And again, lobbying is legal for all 501c3 organizations within those designated limits. There are some exceptions under lobbying. Organizations are going to be permitted to engage in these actions without limitations. You still can't use federal funds on it, but you can spend as much money as you want on this. And those are things like nonpartisan analysis, study, and research of an issue with full and fair exposition. You cannot include a call to action about an issue. Technical advice regarding a written request from a legislative body or committee. Social Current had this issue come up a few years ago. A Senate committee reached out to us and say, hey, we're trying to write a piece of legislation that affects the nonprofit sector. We'd love your feedback on it. They sent us the bill. We provided them technical advice. We were telling them things to change, things to take out, things that would be good, things that would be bad. That might sound like lobbying because it was a written request for technical advice from a legislative body or committee, it was an exception to lobbying, and we were allowed to do it freely and without limits. And finally, self-defense communications. Anything that your organization lobbies on that affects the existence of your nonprofit, the powers and duties of your nonprofit, your 501c3 tax status as a whole, and deductibility of certain items under that status, any legislation having to do with those things, you're allowed to freely lobby without limits. I just want to reiterate, because it is a very easy way to get yourself into a lot of trouble. Your lobbying costs are unallowable to federal awards. Your federal grant and contracting funds should not be allocated to lobbying initiatives with a call to action, regardless of whether that lobbying initiative is going to fulfill a purpose of a federal grant. And all funding should be tracked for lobbying initiatives. These are the things that we at Social Current view as best practice and that I share with organizations that I help educate as best practice. The date that you took the action, what bill or line item you talked about, or it could be the purpose of the grassroots campaign, the audience who you spoke with, the time spent, and your related costs. Again, I say this a lot. Organizations will and can and have gotten into trouble for this. Federal awards cannot be used for lobbying. Private and unrestricted funds, however, may be used. Organizations that have mixed funding can lobby using those private dollars, but this is where tracking comes in, where you have to clearly be able to delineate and show, in case of things like an audit or an investigation, how the money was separated and how that federal funding never touched your lobbying initiatives. Track everything separately, track it in multiple spots. Your finance department should be tracking these things. Your government affairs or whatever entity is doing your lobbying or advocacy should be tracking these things. You should be talking to each other regularly to make sure that everybody is on the same page of what counts for advocacy, what counts for lobbying, and what your organization is doing. Because at the end of the day, the burden of proof in an audit is on your organization, not on the IRS to interpret. It is on you to prove. So I want to take us through briefly a couple of, is it advocacy or is it lobbying? Feel free to throw stuff up in the chat. We'll move through these with a little bit of time to read. So our first question or situation, we're sending an email to our representative's legislative director to share the following update. Through our organization's mentorship programs, our cohort of 30 students collectively experienced a 50% decline in absenteeism and a 75% increase in math and reading test scores in 2024. If we sent that email, are we advocating or are we lobbying? Feel free to throw it up in the chat if you'd like to play this little game. Advocacy, yes. Because our action does not attempt to influence any legislation. Rather, we're just attempting to raise awareness with our members of Congress for the potential benefits that our mentoring programs can offer our community. Here's another one. Sending an email to your grassroots network with the following message. HR 91 would severely limit access to nutrition programs. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that individuals enrolled in SNAP would decrease by 35%. Tell your representatives to vote no on HR 1. Advocacy or lobbying? This is lobbying, and it's a specific type of lobbying called grassroots lobbying. Because the message aims to directly influence legislation, it also includes a bill number and a call to action. Those two check marks we gave a few minutes ago that are the key hallmarks to signal that something is lobbying and that we should track it accordingly. Our next example. What if you called your senator to request that funding for family resource centers be increased in the 2026 appropriations bill? Lobbying. It's direct lobbying as opposed to grassroots lobbying because you're directly doing it. You're not requesting that your grassroots do it. Because again, we checked those two boxes. We reached out to an elected official and we gave them a funding line or a bill, family resource centers, and we told them what we wanted them to do. Check those two boxes, it's lobbying. Inviting your congressperson to attend a community picnic. That's going to be advocacy. All individuals and organizations are permitted to request meetings and to send event invitations to your representatives as much as you want. However, if this is where it comes into educating your members of your staff and your board, because the minute a member of your staff or someone connected to your organization comes up to that member of Congress and says, or that elected official and says, hey, see all this? We do amazing work on our community. We're funded by this. Could you support this? Even that little exchange has turned it into a lobbying event, and the action would need to be tracked accordingly. Requesting that a representative introduce a bill to increase awareness of child abuse. Lobbying or advocacy. That's going to be lobbying because, again, we're requesting that a representative introduce a bill. We're asking them to introduce a bill which is specifically referencing a piece of legislation and at the same time asking them to take action. That's lobbying. We should be tracking it accordingly. Offering to campaign on behalf of a candidate. Advocacy or lobbying? Sarah is 100% right. That is prohibited and a very quick way to lose your 501c3 status. The nonprofit, our sector holds a real significant responsibility, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, to remain nonpartisan. And all of our organizations are not permitted to campaign on behalf of individuals. Concluding a coalition meeting by asking attendees and their networks to participate in a campaign against a bill that is expected to reduce access to SNAP. This is grassroots lobbying. Again, both written and oral attempts to influence legislation qualify as lobbying, and it's grassroots lobbying because we're directing folks to take an action. All these are lobbying initiatives and should be tracked accordingly. So, in the last few minutes I want to talk about an additional step that your 501c3 can take to protect your 501c3 status, and that's through something called the 501h election. So the 501h election is a IRS form. It's 5768 for those who are playing at home. You can submit it at any point in the year. It's not available for private foundations, churches, and what the IRS calls integrated auxiliaries of churches, which would be if a church directly ran a charity or a school or another very associated entity with that church. Additionally, regardless of whether an organization decides to file this form, all 501c3 organizations should continue to carefully and precisely track all lobbying and non-lobby related expenses. And you say, Blair, what's a 501h election? Oh. So, traditionally, the IRS determines the amount that organizations can spend on lobbying through something called the substantial part test. The substantial part test, basically, all it says is that lobbying and cannot be a substantial part of your organization's activity. It's really vague. There's no clear parameters, and for a long time, it sparked confusion, unease, because what is substantial part? 5%, 15%, 50%? So Congress offered something called the 501h, and it is a form that has a formula that gives us clear limits and precisely defines how much we're allowed to spend on lobbying, be that direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying. The 501h expenditure test also has the wonderful benefit of excluding things like unpaid volunteers in terms of resources or money spent towards lobbying. However, the associated related expenses with volunteer activities can count. If you're interested in doing this, please talk to your finance department or your CPA or your in-house counsel. I just want to throw up a little bit more on this. We talked a little about churches and their integrated auxiliaries cannot file the 501h election, and they always are permanently subject to that substantial part test. Other religious nonprofits faith-based service agencies, religious hospitals, faith-based advocacy organizations can file that 501h election, and that gives you those clear spending limits. The exclusion is about church institutions specifically, not religious identity. And it's worth noting that only 1.3% of eligible nonprofits in this country filed their 501h election as of a few years ago, 2009. Most didn't even know that they could. So it is a underused procedure to really define how we can lobby and how much we can lobby. So we're running out of time. The 501h election permits lobbying according to something called the exempt purpose expenditure. And the exempt purpose expenditures are paid or incurred by an electing public charity, the 501c3 organization, to accomplish the organization's exempt purpose. And these include things like the total amount paid or incurred to achieve that mission, amounts paid or incurred to attempt influence legislation, allowance for depreciation or amortization, and fundraising expenditures. So it's basically you get your limit, you get your exempt purpose expenditure, you figure out what that is, and then it spits it out into a chart which gives you how much money you can spend on lobbying. And the absolute limit, no matter how big your 501c3 is, you can only spend up to $1 million on lobbying. Grassroots lobbying, we talked about that in the example a few minutes ago, where it was directing individuals to contact their member of Congress about a specific bill with a specific action. That's going to be 25% of your total lobbying limit. So if you were the big nonprofit, big 501c3, and you had $1 million to use on lobbying based on the 501h, you can only spend $250,000 on grassroots lobbying. This is just another example. If your exempt purpose budget is $2 million, the total lobbying cap would be $250,000 with that grassroots cap at 62.5. And this is the chart that's sourced from the IRS. Regardless of your 501h status, the importance of advocacy, I hope I've communicated, cannot be overstated. The work that people like Sarah do as a part of your organization to advocate for the work of all your amazing communities is a testament and is incredibly effective in Congress. Strong advocates hold the power to significantly safeguard and improve the health and well-being of community members. I know we're in the business of safeguarding things right now, but that won't last forever. And partnering with committee members and other elected officials offers you a collaborative approach to help ensure that all community members have resources needed to thrive. So, how can we activate board members and our volunteers? Remember, volunteer time does not count against your 501h limits. Only paid staff time and costs count. Volunteer hours are free against your lobbying cap, so use them in your lobbying and advocacy efforts. Board members are your most credible advocates. A board member's personal relationship with a legislature or a legislator often outweighs the formal staff ask. Washington, D.C. is a relationship-driven town. Utilize your board members and their relationships to further your advocacy and lobbying. Build advocacy into your governance. Set a goal of one legislative contact per board member per year and provide simple toolkits to make it easy. Developing a culture of advocacy is even more important. Advocacy is most effective when we practice it continually rather than isolated to critical legislation popping up 2 or 3 times a year. Consider adding organizational trainings for board members and staff. At Social Current, we institute a top-down approach. Everyone from our most basic entry-level person to the president of our board has gone through an advocacy training curriculum. Prioritize issue-based, mission-focused, and nonpartisan initiatives. Meanwhile, always track time and funding for all your lobbying initiatives, which, if I haven't mentioned yet, lobbying is completely legal for 501c3s to do. Just a couple final reflections to share with you. As you and your organization prepare to lead advocacy initiatives and respond to pressing issues, remember the one asset, which is the greatest asset that you hold that nobody else in your in DC does, is you have a deep connection to your community and a specialized knowledge of your community. And through the services you deliver, you have grown to know the unique facets of your community, their strength, and deep power. And while rapidly evolving climates, especially political climates, presents real challenges to our organizations and our communities, preparation, focus, and message discipline are key guiding foundations to respond to these challenges accurately and in full alignment in maintaining your organization's missions and values and maintaining that trust that you've so diligently built with your community. These are simple things that I do, again, to track advocacy and lobbying. I believe everybody will get a copy of the presentation, so it'll be in here. Just some key tips on how to do your recording. Some sample codings, which will be in the presentation or in the. Finally, if any of these resonated with you, if you have questions, comments, concerns, if something comes up at 2 o'clock in the morning and you just need an answer to this, this is my cell phone number. This is my email address. Please feel free to reach out to folks like Sarah, your government affairs team here at LSS, or anyone like someone like me. My number 2 at Social Current, Abigail, that's her email, if for some reason I don't answer. So I'm happy to take questions, and thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much, Blair. We really appreciate it. This was really informative. One question that I wanted to ask, because I know this comes up a lot, and especially we're looking at an election year, midterm election year this year. Let's say we have the case that somebody wants to invite a candidate to visit their site. You know, there's a major challenger. How does that fit in, or what are the rules there?
Again, with specific instances like that, it's always good to check with counsel on these things. But more generally, as long as your organization is not making an endorsement or rejecting a candidate, there's nothing that stops you from inviting at that point. They're a private citizen to your organization's event and having them learn more about your organization. That's just advocacy.
Would it typically be best practice, just, and I'll caveat this with saying, in your opinion or in your practice, to, if you're inviting one candidate, to invite the other?
From a legal perspective, Sarah, I don't think if you invited specifically one candidate and not the other, it would present a legal challenge. But in terms of building and maintaining that nonpartisan relationship with your community, it's always good to at least extend the invite.
Okay, thank you. And I'll open it up if anyone else has questions. If you're shy and want to drop it in the chat. Otherwise, if you just want to unmute yourself and ask a question. Here, Stephanie, I'll ask it for you. Stephanie Shadid asks, for organizations that provide housing, are residents held to those requirements while on their property? In other words, they operate a housing facility or a nursing home.
No, I do not believe they'd be held, and you would have to track those requirements. That's one of those little weird nuances that you're going to want to check with your attorneys on specifically, but just broadly based on how I would advise organizations, no. As long as they are a benefit of your program and they are free to exercise their First Amendment rights to tell their members of Congress about what they're doing and about how great your program is. So no, that would not count as lobbying.
And they're not employees of the organization.
Correct.
And we've also gotten another question. What are considerations if I'm an employee of a nonprofit? What considerations are there if I, in my private life, at 7 p.m. endorsed a candidate or did something overtly political?
So, this question comes up. I do a lot. I have a son who has special needs. I do a lot of lobbying in my own free time on pediatric brain science. When I go to Capitol Hill, when I endorse a candidate on what social media I have left, I always make sure to explicit when it's on social media. There's no Social Current logo in the corner of my profile picture. I make sure not to, I do say, in my private capacity, I am very explicit. When I go to Capitol Hill, I don't use the cell phone that Social Current may subsidize. I don't wear my Social Current name tag. At the beginning of the interaction with the member of Congress, I say, hey, I know you know me as this, but I'm here in my own private and personal capacity today. Anything you can do to draw as many lines of separation between your organization and you when you take those actions, it may seem superfluous at times, but it's all about protecting yourself and your organization.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Or Kylie, I don't know if we're seeing other questions in the chat. I'll then close with you, but and folks, please stick around. We're going to do our closing poll and see how well. And I even learned and was refreshed and reminded on some things. But Blair, this has been really very helpful and informative. And as you mentioned, we've made a recording of this session and we'll be providing the slides to folks. And Blair has so graciously made available contact information if you have questions after the fact. So with that, I'm going to put up our post poll. That same question, except now, how would you rate your knowledge having participated in the webinar? We've got a lot of good movement upward, onward and upward. Nobody's left with no knowledge, so that's a great sign. I'll let that just percolate a minute and then I'll share with folks. But I know this is especially this midterm election year, this time of year, these kinds of issues can kind of become top of mind for people as they, as you said, there's sometimes a perception that I'm a nonprofit, we're not allowed to do anything political, but define political versus advocacy and lobbying is always the key question. So, yeah, so we moved up quite a bit. We've got now 52% saying I have good knowledge and 22 strong knowledge, and the remainder in basic knowledge. So we've moved certainly everybody up a peg, which is great. And that tells me that we had a lot of room for growth here, and we really learned a lot. So,
so Blair, I've got a question real quick.
Great.
I pulled up the form, the 501 H election form. And so if the way I read that, it's too late to do that for 2026. It says you have to do this before the first of the year that you're asking for the exemption. Can you clarify that for us?
That is, you can file that at any time. In terms of when it kicks in for what year you are in, that's going to vary based on what the form says. Those are one of those instances, Rodney, where I would definitely ask your CPA or your in-house counsel just to make sure you're working on correct numbers.
Okay, thank you.
And we've got one more late breaking question. And this may relate to what I had raised at the beginning of our Q&A, but if candidates wish to speak at an event, does that opportunity to attend and speak need to be extended to all candidates in that race?
In terms of the legal implications, that's something that you definitely should ask counsel about. I don't think there's legal implications off the top of my head, but in terms of maintaining that nonpartisanship, which is incredibly key to what we do, I would never allow one of my organizations to not at least invite, so that when we're inevitably asked, like I can say, oh, here's the email that we sent. We invited them multiple times. They said no. We can't drag them here.
Right. Yep. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I think that's always important to remember. It's what actions you take to allow for the participation of all the candidates is important. You can't, sometimes people can't come, don't want to come, aren't engaged. So, well, great. If we have no other questions, I just want to close by saying again, thank you to Blair very much for this great presentation. And thank you to Melissia for being with us and sharing what you're working on in St. Louis County. Information about our next webinar in April will be circulated shortly. We hope to be speaking at that point about some updates to our Here We Stand Medicaid and other social issue messaging. And we also invite you, as always, to join us on Community in our Advocacy Leads group, even if you're not necessarily officially an advocacy staff person for your organization. If you'd like to be there and hear from us about advocacy issues or updates that we have, that's a great place for it. We'll share the link to that and how to join in our follow-up emails. and as well as the recording and the other materials. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate all of your time and effort to be with us, and look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.